A war veteran retreats to the mountains with only his loyal dog for company, hoping to leave his past behind. But a shocking discovery in the wilderness, an abandoned military secret, pulls him back into a deadly hunt. Betrayal, survival, and the unwavering loyalty of a dog become his only weapons against an enemy determined to silence him. This is not just a story of war, but of truth, sacrifice, and healing. If you believe loyalty can save a life, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts below. The first light of dawn crept over the Bitterroot Mountains, painting the peaks in shades of copper, and rose while the valley below clung to its pockets of fog. Daniel Ross sat on the porch of his cabin, his body wrapped in the quiet ritual of morning. A chipped ceramic mug sat warm in his hand, filled with black coffee strong enough to burn the back of his throat. He liked it that way, sharp, no sugar, no cream, nothing to soften the bite. It was a taste that reminded him he was alive. His cabin was modest, built from pine logs darkened by years of weather. It wasn't much, but every nail and board had been placed by his own hand. To him, it was more than shelter. It was a barricade against the noise of the world he had walked away from. After years of sandstorms, gunfire, and the suffocating heat of the desert, Montana's silence felt like a second skin. And yet, silence was also dangerous. Silence gave memories room to crawl back in. At his feet lay Hunter, stretched out across the wooden planks, eyes half shut but never truly asleep. The German Shepherd was 4 years old now, his coat a striking blend of slate gray and fawn. His ears twitched at every sound. A raven's call, the creak of the trees, even the distant echo of water running through the valley. Hunter was more than a companion. He was an anchor. Daniel remembered the day they first met like a scar that never faded. He had gone to the shelter not looking for a dog but looking for something he couldn't name. Hunter had been locked in the farthest cage, snarling and pacing, eyes burning with mistrust. The staff called him a lost cause, unadoptable. Daniel had simply crouched by the bars and stared back. Two broken beings had studied each other in silence until Hunter, with a hesitant motion, pressed his nose against the cage. Daniel had reached out, and in that moment, the deal was struck. Man and dog, both written off, deciding they weren't done yet. Now, years later, Hunter was as much a part of Daniel's existence as the rifle leaning against the porch rail or the scars across his knuckles. "Not a bad morning, huh, boy?" Daniel murmured, dragging his hand across the dog's thick fur. Hunter lifted his head, amber eyes locking onto his master's face, and thumped his tail against the wood. It was an answer Daniel understood better than words. He rose, stretching the stiffness out of his lean frame. His shoulders still carried the strength of a Marine, though time and solitude had added a quiet heaviness to his posture. He slipped into his jacket, slung his rifle across his back, and tightened the straps of a small day pack. "Let's see what the woods have for us," he said. That was all it took. Hunter sprang to his feet, muscles taut with energy, his tail cutting the air in anticipation. They set off together, man and dog swallowed by the dark green canopy of the forest. The wilderness wrapped around them in layers, the damp earth rich with the scent of pine needles, the crunch of frost beneath boots and paws, the distant flutter of wings overhead. Daniel moved like he had been born here, each step measured, eyes scanning without thought. Old habits from the battlefield had transformed into a hunter's rhythm. For hours they followed deer signs across the ridges. Daniel crouched often, running his fingers along the soft earth, noting the freshness of a hoofprint or the broken edge of a branch. Hunter mirrored his intensity, nose working, body low, a shadow gliding just ahead. At last, they found what they were looking for. A fresh trail, the marks crisp in the damp soil, leading through the brush. Daniel leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper meant for his dog alone. "We've got something, buddy." Hunter's ears flicked forward, his body stiff with focus. And then, without warning, the rhythm broke. Hunter froze, head lifted high, nose tilted to the left. Daniel expected him to tighten on the deer's trail, but instead the dog barked once, sharp, insistent, and bolted away from the prints. "Hunter!" Daniel hissed, half whisper, half shout. He hadn't heard that tone from the dog since the day he brought him home, a sound that meant urgency, not prey. His gut tightened. He had learned long ago that when Hunter broke discipline, it was never without cause. Cursing under his breath, Daniel pushed after him, shoving through undergrowth that clawed at his jacket, branches snapping under his boots. The forest grew darker, the canopy thickening, until even the sun seemed to hesitate in following them. After what felt like endless minutes, Hunter stopped abruptly. His body went rigid, tail stiff, ears flat. Daniel skidded to a halt beside him, chest heaving, and followed his dog's gaze. What stood before them was not the deer they had been tracking, but something altogether different. A structure, metal and forgotten, sat half-buried in vines and moss. Rust streaked its sides, the roof sagged under decades of neglect, and a broken padlock dangled uselessly from the warped door. An old storage shed, maybe military, maybe industrial, but out here in the middle of nowhere it was a ghost of something that shouldn't exist. Daniel's first instinct was to turn away. Trouble had a scent, and this place reeked of it. But Hunter growled low in his throat, a sound not of threat but of warning. His eyes locked on the door, body trembling with tension. Daniel swallowed hard, the old rhythm of adrenaline beginning to stir in his blood. He stepped closer, boots crunching in the silence, his rifle strap biting against his shoulder. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of oil and damp metal. Somewhere deep in his bones, Daniel knew, whatever lay inside that shed would change everything. Daniel hesitated at the doorway of the shed, a silhouette against the dim light that barely crept through cracks in the rusted tin roof. The air smelled of rot and damp wood, but beneath it lingered something sharper, something that didn't belong to a place abandoned for decades. He adjusted his stance, his body automatically slipping into the cautious rhythm of a soldier clearing a room. Hunter had already padded forward, paws silent on the warped floorboards, head low, nose twitching as if every breath drew in a story only he could read. Daniel followed slowly, every step deliberate, his boots crunching on dust that should have lain still but instead revealed a trail of disruption. He crouched low, his eyes narrowing at the floor. The dust bore patterns that told him more than words could. Boot prints, fresh and clean-edged, the kind that had been pressed within the last day. He traced one with the tips of his fingers, recognizing the depth, the weight distribution. Heavy steps, men carrying gear, at least two if not more. His breath thinned, and he rose again, scanning. Along the far wall, a cardboard box slumped open, cans spilled from its torn side. He stepped closer, picked one up, and turned it in his hand. A can of beans, label crisp, the expiration date a year away. His chest tightened. Abandoned places didn't stock fresh food. Someone had been here, someone organized enough to use this place as a depot. His eyes shifted toward the wall where faint grooves etched the boards, long and shallow, as if crates had been dragged across. He followed the marks to where the floor dipped near the doorway, his gaze pulling outward to the forest beyond. He remembered the faint tracks he'd seen on the approach, half covered by pine needles, narrow tires biting into the soil. They matched. This wasn't a coincidence. Hunter barked once, sharp, startling him from thought. Daniel turned fast, heart jolting, rifle strap biting into his shoulder. The dog's body strained, jaws clamped around the strap of something hidden in the shadows. With a grunt, Hunter dragged it free, claws scraping wood as he hauled the object into the light. A pack, military issue, canvas battered but intact, metal buckles dulled by time but functional. Daniel froze. For a moment, the world around him fell silent. His knees bent slowly as he reached out, brushing dirt and dust from its surface, his fingers lingering on the stitching. He knew this object, and had lived out of one just like it for years. Assault packs like this were standard gear, but finding one here, in a shed forgotten in the Montana wilderness, made no sense. Hunter dropped it at his feet and sat back, panting softly, his tail brushing the floor once, as if to say, "Look closer." Daniel unbuckled the flap. Inside lay fragments of a life, a poncho liner torn at the edges, stiff with dried mud, a canteen dented but empty, scraps of paper so damp they crumbled at his touch. And then, tucked deep in the bottom, his fingers brushed something firm. He pulled it free. A map case, olive drab, the kind issued to field officers. He stared at it, his pulse quickening. With deliberate care, he unlatched it and slid out folded sheets of paper. Maps, topographical charts of the region. He spread them open, his breath catching as he saw the marks scrawled in black ink. Circles, X's, lines cutting across valleys and ridges with military precision. This was no hunter's map, no hiker's notes. It was the language of patrols and staging grounds, written in the shorthand only someone like him could read. His stomach clenched, the edges of his vision dimming as memories flooded in. The desert sun blistering overhead, the sweat stinging his eyes as he leaned over a Humvee hood studying maps just like these, his commanding officer barking orders, the sharp metallic crack of rifles in the distance. He heard the screaming again, the confusion, the dust cloud lifting to reveal a boy no older than 12, limp and broken in his arms. The maps shook in his hands, the shed spinning, the air closing in. His throat went dry, his knees threatening to buckle. Ghosts he had spent years trying to bury clawed their way out, merciless and vivid. Hunter moved instantly, pressing against his leg, shoving his muzzle into Daniel's chest with an insistent force. The contact was grounding, a heavy weight that reminded him of the present, of now, of the solid, breathing creature at his side. Daniel's hand fell, fingers tangling in Hunter's fur, clutching as though it were the only tether keeping him from slipping into the abyss. His breathing steadied, ragged at first, then slower. He closed his eyes, whispered hoarsely, "I'm here. I'm not there." Hunter didn't move, his amber eyes watching, steady, unwavering. When Daniel finally opened his eyes, the maps were still in his hands, their marks no less alarming, but no longer blurred by memory. He folded them carefully, slid them back into the case, and tucked it into the pack. His jaw tightened. The evidence was undeniable now. This wasn't the forgotten wreck of some bygone era. This was active, recently. The cans, the boot prints, the tracks, the pack, it all formed a picture he didn't want to see but could no longer ignore. Someone had chosen this shed deliberately. Someone had walked these floors within the last day. Someone would return. Daniel rose, his fingers brushing the rifle strap again, eyes scanning the dark corners of the shed as if shadows themselves could lunge forward. Hunter remained close, pressed to his thigh, ears cocked, waiting for the next command. And though Daniel wanted nothing more than to walk away, he knew deep down that whatever path he chose now, he had already crossed a line. There was no turning back. Daniel's grip on the pack tightened as he stepped back from the wall, his boots pressing into the faint grooves that had been carved by crates dragged across the floor. He could feel the air shift in the shed, as though the weight of his discovery had awakened something that was better left buried. He had no reason to stay longer. Every instinct screamed at him to leave while he still could, to vanish into the timberline and let the forest swallow whatever story had been unfolding here. He motioned to Hunter with a tilt of his head, and the dog, ever alert, fell into step. As Daniel turned toward the warped doorway, his eyes caught a small glint in the corner near the rafters. At first, he thought it was just a trick of light catching a nail, but then it blinked, a faint red shimmer barely perceptible against the dimness. His chest went cold. He froze, forcing himself to breathe evenly, while his mind catalogued what he was seeing. A lens, tiny, embedded in what looked like a knothole. A camera, camouflaged, its edges painted to mimic the wood around it. He felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. He was being watched. Not just recently, but right now, this very moment. A slow burn of adrenaline surged through him. His jaw clenched, and without breaking his stride, he adjusted the strap of his rifle and stepped into the daylight. He did not run. Running would confirm too much. Instead, he let his pace remain steady, forcing his body to mimic the calm of a man who had stumbled into nothing of consequence. Inside, his thoughts roared with one refrain: they know. Hunter trotted at his side, but his ears were pinned back, his body tense as though he too sensed the invisible eye that had followed them. Daniel didn't allow himself to look back until the shed was a speck among the trees. Even then, the certainty gnawed at him. Whoever had placed that camera would see his face, would know his gait, his dog, his rifle. His cover of anonymity in these woods had just been burned away. By the time he reached the trail leading toward his cabin, the sun was angling lower, the air thickening with the scent of pine resin and the sound of the creek cutting through stone. He forced his mind to stillness, every step deliberate. The pack weighed heavy against his shoulders, as though it carried more than canvas and maps. He wanted to drop it, to toss it into the stream and watch it vanish, but he knew he couldn't. It was the only thread he had, and threads like this pulled men into deeper webs whether they wanted it or not. Back at the cabin, he secured the windows first, out of habit, sliding shutters into place though the sky was still pale. He set his rifle against the wall and lowered the pack onto the table, its presence dominating the small space. Hunter circled the room twice, sniffing the corners, before settling near the door, his body rigid, head raised, ears twitching at every distant noise. Daniel unbuckled the flap and pulled the contents into the thin wash of evening light. The poncho liner, the dented canteen, the maps folded with military precision, but beneath the layers, something else caught his hand. A piece of paper, crumpled into the corner as if shoved there in haste. He drew it out slowly, careful not to tear it further. The sheet was stained, edges frayed, handwriting scrawled across it in uneven strokes. He laid it flat on the table, smoothed it with the palm of his hand, and read. The words were simple, desperate, almost childlike in their urgency. Please take the truth outside. His breath caught. His hand hovered over the ink, as though it could still feel the tremor of the one who had written it. For a long moment, the cabin disappeared. He was back under desert skies, crouched beside a fallen friend whose last words had been little more than a whisper. He remembered gripping that man's hand, promising to carry his story home, promising that his sacrifice would mean something. Yet here he was, years later, living like a ghost in the wilderness, pretending those words hadn't been carved into him. His throat closed, and his eyes burned in a way he hadn't allowed in years. The letter was more than a plea. It was an echo of every voice he had failed to bring home, every brother whose truth had died in the dirt with them. His hand shook as he pressed it flat to the paper, a silent acknowledgement of the weight it carried. Hunter rose quietly and padded over, nudging his head against Daniel's arm, the same way he always did when memories threatened to pull him under. Daniel let out a ragged exhale, his hand moving instinctively to the dog's fur, gripping as though to steady himself. I hear it, he whispered, his voice low and rough. I hear it. The words weren't just for Hunter. They were for the man who had written the letter, for the ghosts who haunted him still, for the truth that now sat on his table demanding not to be ignored. The last light of the day slipped through the shutters, throwing the cramped cabin into shadows, the paper glowing faintly in the dimness as though it carried its own light. Outside, the forest held its breath. Daniel sat still, his hand resting on Hunter's back, the letter before him, the map spread wide, and the camera's unblinking eye still burning in his mind. Daniel sat frozen in the dim cabin, the paper with its shaky plea still spread before him like a wound that refused to close. Hunter pressed close, the steady warmth of the dog keeping him tethered while his mind wrestled with memories he had spent years avoiding. He ran a hand over his face, then forced himself to return to the pack, to the things inside it that might explain why a soldier's voice had been left scribbled on torn paper in the Montana wilderness. He set aside the poncho liner, the dented canteen, the folded maps, his movements careful, methodical, until his fingers brushed something harder, slimmer, wedged in the narrow seam between the canvas and the frame. He pulled it free, and found himself holding a small black flash drive, military grade, its casing scratched but intact, no markings except a faint engraving of numbers too worn to read. He turned it over in his hand, the weight of it disproportionate to its size, because he knew from instinct alone that this was no ordinary drive. With a sharp breath, he rose, crossed to the old laptop on the corner table, the one he kept for emergencies but rarely touched, and powered it up. The machine hummed to life, screen flickering pale blue. He inserted the drive and waited, Hunter's eyes following every move, his ears twitching as if he too sensed the shift in the room. The screen is filled with folders, neat, coded, precise. Daniel leaned closer, jaw set, his hand tight on the mouse. He clicked one. A list appeared, rows of shipments detailed with the cold efficiency of bureaucracy, dates, serial numbers, locations. His chest constricted as he scanned down the lines, his breath catching when he saw the items named rifles, explosives, anti-aircraft systems. Weapons fresh and lethal, moved like freight across oceans. His gut twisted as his eyes followed the column of destinations. Some were bases he recognized, legitimate transfers to Allied forces, but buried among them were names that should not have been there, places known for their instability, their insurgencies. His hand trembled as he clicked deeper, following a thread of falsified documents until he landed on one entry that made his blood run cold. The target listed was vague, written only as Middle East Sector. His vision blurred, not with exhaustion, but with the flood of memory that surged unbidden. He was back there, Under the unrelenting sun, boots grinding into sand, his rifle heavy but steady as he scanned the horizon. He heard the crack of distant fire, the shouts of his unit, the confusion of smoke curling upward. And then, more vivid than anything else, the face of the boy. 11, maybe 12, too young to hold the fear that wide in his eyes. Daniel had found him crouched behind a wall of broken stone, shrapnel embedded in his leg, dust streaked across his skin. He remembered lowering his weapon, tearing strips from his own uniform to stop the bleeding, ignoring the chaos around him as he lifted the boy into his arms and carried him toward safety. The boy had clung to him, whispering something in a language Daniel barely understood, but the gratitude was clear, as sharp as the pain etched across his face. Daniel had saved him, one child in a place where too many were lost, and yet here, now, staring at the cold language of the file, he knew how fragile that salvation had been. If these weapons, these shipments, reached the wrong hands, the boy's survival would have meant nothing. Children like him, families like his, villages that had barely clung to peace would be turned into battlegrounds once more. His breath hitched, his fist slamming against the table hard enough to rattle the screen. Hunter startled but stayed close, whining low, his head nudging against Daniel's arm as though to anchor him again. Daniel let the dog's weight steady him, his other hand still gripping the mouse, his eyes locked on the words before him. The plea in the letter was no longer abstract. It was the same plea that boys' eyes had carried all those years ago. Do not let this happen. Do not let the truth die in silence. His throat burned, his chest tight with a mixture of rage and sorrow that words could not contain. He closed the folder, but the images lingered, seared into him, reminding him that what sat on this drive was more than data. It was a fuse, already lit, and in the wrong hands it would ignite a chain of destruction reaching far beyond the walls of his cabin. He leaned back, eyes closing for a moment, the weight of memory pressing down on him like the desert sun all over again. Hunter shifted closer, resting his chin on Daniel's knee, amber eyes steady, reminding him that he wasn't alone in this battle. When Daniel opened his eyes again, the screen still glowed with its damning evidence, and the night outside pressed close against the shuttered windows, heavy with a silence that felt less like peace and more like the breath held before a storm. Daniel hardly slept, his eyes fixed on the glow of the laptop long after the files had burned their way into his mind. The silence of the mountains pressed heavy against the cabin walls, but it was no longer the peace he had once sought here. It was suffocating, a silence that felt watched. Hunter never truly rested either, ears twitching, body shifting with unease as though he sensed what Daniel's instincts had already screamed. Someone knew they were here. When dawn broke gray and thin through the shutters, Daniel rose, every muscle stiff, his chest tight with the residue of restless hours. He slung the rifle across his shoulder, eased the door open, and stepped onto the porch. The air was sharp with pine and damp soil, but layered beneath it was something acrid, faint but present, the smell of smoke that had no business drifting from the ground around his cabin. His eyes scanned the perimeter, sharp and disciplined. At first he saw only dew clinging to blades of grass, the forest stretching quiet and endless. But then he noticed it, a distortion in the earth near the woodpile. He crouched, fingers brushing the soil. The imprint was clear, the tread of boots pressed deep, and not his own. He traced the pattern, following where it curved around the cabin, circling, pausing near windows. The prints overlapped, layered enough to tell him the intruder had stayed, had lingered long into the night. His pulse quickened, his throat going dry. He straightened, his gaze darting to the trees at the edge of the clearing, every shadow suddenly alive with menace. He knew what this meant. He had not only been found, but watched, studied, measured, like prey. The hunter had become the hunted. Hunter, the dog, padded to his side, nose low to the ground, tail stiff, confirming what Daniel already knew. Someone had been close, too close. He drew a long breath, steadying himself, suppressing the surge of panic with the old Marine's discipline that had never truly left him. Then Hunter veered toward the porch steps, his body tense, ears pricked. He barked once, sharp, then trotted forward, nose pressed to a patch of charred earth near the edge of the clearing. Daniel followed quickly, eyes narrowing as he took in the blackened remnants of something burned in haste. Ash and half-melted scraps of plastic smoldered faintly in the damp morning air. Whoever had been here had not only circled the cabin but tested their fire, torching trash, maybe to intimidate, maybe to send a message. Daniel crouched again, sifting through the remains, but it was Hunter who froze, then lowered his head and carefully gripped something half buried in the ash. The dog pulled it free, padding back toward Daniel with the object clamped gently in his jaws. He dropped it at Daniel's boots and stepped back, watching with solemn intensity. Daniel bent down, his hands trembling as he picked it up. A wallet. The leather was scorched, edges curled, the surface cracked and brittle. He turned it over slowly, his breath locked in his chest. Against all odds, the clasp still held. With careful fingers, he opened it. Inside, protected by a plastic sleeve half melted from heat, was a photograph. The edges had burned, the colors had faded, but the image was unmistakable. A little girl, no more than 8, her hair tied back with a ribbon, her smile wide and unguarded in a way only children can be. His daughter. His knees buckled, and he staggered back, collapsing onto the porch step as if struck. His vision blurred, his chest constricted, until it felt like the mountain itself had pressed down on him. He clutched the photograph to his chest, his heart tearing open with the memory he had locked away for so long. The screech of tires, the call that shattered his world, the day everything he had fought to protect slipped through his fingers in a way no battlefield ever had. His daughter, gone in an instant, and him left with nothing but silence and regret. The wallet trembled in his grip as though it might fall apart entirely. He wanted to scream, to give in, to let the grief drag him under the way it always threatened to. But then Hunter moved closer, pressing his body firmly against Daniel's side, his amber eyes fixed on him with an intensity that pierced through the haze. The dog's gaze was steady, insistent, a silent command as powerful as any bark. Do not break. Do not fall. Stand. Daniel let out a ragged breath, his hand moving to rest on Hunter's head, gripping tight, the familiar fur grounding him once again. He swallowed hard, forcing the tears back, forcing the soldier in him to rise through the father's anguish. I hear you, he whispered hoarsely, to Hunter, to the memory of his daughter, to the ghosts pressing in from all sides. The wallet felt impossibly heavy in his hand, the photograph searing into his soul, not just as a memory of loss but as a reason to keep standing, to fight, to see through whatever darkness had begun stalking him. He lifted his gaze to the tree line again, the weight of the enemy unseen but certain. This wasn't just about secrets hidden in maps or files on a drive. It was about every life stolen, every child endangered, every truth buried. His daughter's smile burned in his vision, fragile and bright, a reminder that giving up was no longer an option. Hunter shifted, ears pricking toward the forest, a low growl building in his throat. Daniel rose slowly, tucking the wallet into his pocket, his rifle strap sliding back over his shoulder, his eyes narrowing. The cabin that had been his sanctuary was no longer a refuge. It was a cage, and someone was waiting for him to realize it. The night pressed in heavy and restless, the kind of night when every sound seemed magnified, when the creak of a tree or the snap of a twig echoed like a gunshot in Daniel's ears. He sat at the table, the wallet with the charred photograph lying open beside the maps and the flash drive, the fire in the stove long since gone cold. Hunter lay at the door, rigid, his eyes glowing faint in the dark, his chest rising in slow, deliberate breaths, waiting for what both of them sensed was coming. Daniel couldn't shake the image of the boot prints circling the cabin. He replayed them in his mind again and again, the way they stopped by each window, lingered near the porch, studied every corner of his sanctuary. Whoever was out there, they hadn't just stumbled upon him. They knew. They were measuring, preparing. He tightened the strap on his rifle, the old instincts sharpening like a blade drawn from a sheath, and whispered a command to Hunter, who lifted his head instantly, ears pricked. That was when Daniel smelled it, faint at first, then thicker, the acrid bite of gasoline mingled with smoke drifting through the cracks in the shutters. His heart lurched. He grabbed the pack from the table, shoved the drive and the maps inside, and crossed to the door in 2 strides. He flung it open, and the night blazed with the first hungry tongues of fire licking up the side of the cabin. Flames danced orange and violent along the wall, devouring the dry wood like it had been waiting for this moment. Somewhere beyond the trees, he thought he heard movement, boots retreating into the darkness, but there was no time to confirm. Move! He shouted, and Hunter leapt out first, his body a streak of muscle and fur against the chaos. Daniel followed, the heat scorching his face, smoke filling his lungs, as the fire roared higher, wrapping the cabin in an inferno. He sprinted with Hunter into the tree line, the glow of flames behind them throwing monstrous shadows across the forest. Branches whipped at his arms, roots threatened to snag his boots, but he didn't stop until the fire's roar was a distant growl and the night swallowed them again. They collapsed near a fallen log. Daniel bent over, coughing hard, clutching the pack as if it were the last anchor to reality. Hunter stood guard, his body trembling but alert, his eyes never leaving the dark woods behind them. The smell of burning pine drifted on the wind, and Daniel knew the cabin, his fragile sanctuary, was gone. They had forced his hand. He could no longer pretend he had a choice. He dragged in a ragged breath, unzipped the pack, and pulled the flash drive from its pocket. The small piece of metal gleamed faintly in the moonlight, deceptively ordinary for the danger it carried. He stared at it, his hand trembling, rage and exhaustion warring in his chest. This thing had destroyed everything, his peace, his refuge, his fragile attempt at a life beyond the battlefield. It was a target on his back, a death sentence waiting to be cashed. He clenched his jaw, pulled back his arm, ready to fling it into the ravine that yawned beyond the log, to rid himself of its weight forever. But before the motion could complete, Hunter shifted. The dog turned, his body still facing the forest as if guarding, but his head tilted toward Daniel. His amber eyes locked onto him, unwavering, holding him in a stare so long and so steady that Daniel felt the breath hitch in his throat. It wasn't just a look. It was a question, clear and silent. If you drop that, whose blood will stain your hands instead? Daniel's arm froze mid-motion, his chest tightening with the force of the unspoken words. He saw again the boy in the desert, his daughter's smile in the photo, the plea scribbled on the torn paper. He felt the weight of every voice silenced by betrayal. His arm lowered slowly, the drive closing back into his fist. He let out a shuddering exhale, pressing the device against his forehead for a moment, as if to remind himself what it meant. Hunter blinked, then turned back toward the trees, his body rigid once more, satisfied with the answer. Daniel slipped the drive back into the pack, zipped it shut, and rested his hand briefly on Hunter's back, grounding himself in the loyalty that had never wavered. "You're right," he whispered hoarsely. "We can't let it go." The fire's glow still painted the sky behind them, a reminder of what they had lost, of what had been taken to force them onto this path. Ahead, the forest stretched endless and dark, a labyrinth of unknowns where each shadow could hide an enemy. Daniel rose, his shoulders heavy but squared, his rifle secure, the pack a burden he could no longer abandon. Hunter stood with him, ears tuned, muscles coiled, ready to move. Together they stepped deeper into the night, the forest closing around them, carrying with them the truth that could no longer be buried, and the eyes of hunters waiting in the dark. The night after the fire had been a blur of movement. Every step Daniel and Hunter took deeper into the woods weighted with the knowledge that the hunters were out there, closer now than ever. Smoke still hung faintly on the breeze as they moved through the jagged ridges, staying off the trails, moving silently as ghosts. By late the following day, exhaustion drove them to the edge of a logging road that cut through the forest like a scar. Daniel crouched low behind a thicket, his eyes narrowing as he spotted two trucks idling near a makeshift camp, their tarps drawn over cargo that seemed too carefully guarded to be timber or feed. He signaled Hunter down, his hand pressing lightly against the dog's flank, and studied the scene. Men milled about with the casual vigilance of those who thought themselves unseen, their movements tight, weapons visible on their hips. Daniel felt his chest tighten with the unmistakable pulse of danger, but also of confirmation. The files on the drive had not been lies. This was the proof carved into steel and tarpaulin before his eyes. Waiting until the men dispersed, he slipped from cover, moving low and quick across the damp earth until he reached the shadowed edge of the first truck. Hunter followed, silent as smoke, pressing close. Daniel eased himself under the rear tarp and froze at what lay within. Crates, stacked in neat rows, the wood new and sharp-smelling. He pried open the lid of one with his knife, the nails giving way with a faint groan. Inside lay rifles, dozens of them, black and gleaming, untouched by dust or use. He reached for one, lifting it into the pale light that leaked through the canvas, and his breath caught. The serial number plate had been filed down smooth, obliterating any trace of origin. His jaw clenched, the truth searing itself deeper into him. These weren't weapons meant for allies. These were ghosts, untraceable, ready to be sold to whoever had the money or the motive. His pulse hammered as he replaced the rifle, shut the crate, and eased back. He had seen enough. He turned, ready to slip away, but the sound of footsteps froze him. Heavy boots crunching gravel. He ducked into the narrow space between the truck and a stack of barrels, pressing Hunter close. A man appeared, broad-shouldered, his face shadowed under a cap, moving with the weary gait of someone who had driven too long. He carried a thermos in one hand, muttering under his breath as he climbed into the cab. For a moment, Daniel thought he had escaped notice. Then the man paused, his gaze sweeping the area as if drawn by instinct, and his eyes locked on the shadow where Daniel crouched. Time slowed. Daniel's hand tightened on his rifle, ready to act, but the man didn't shout. Instead, his expression shifted, confusion carving deep into his features. His lips parted, and he whispered words Daniel barely caught over the thud of his own heart. "He's still alive." The voice hit Daniel harder than any bullet could have. It wasn't just recognition in the man's eyes, it was a memory. Daniel's breath caught, his grip loosening as he stepped into the thin strip of moonlight, disbelief written across his face. The man blinked, as though seeing a ghost. Daniel knew that face, older now, harsher, but carved forever into his memory. Sergeant Mark Harris, his brother-in-arms, the man he had last seen swallowed by fire and rubble overseas, a man whose name was etched on the wall of the dead. Daniel's throat constricted, his mind racing with images of the past, blood, smoke, the frantic scramble to pull bodies from wreckage, and the certainty he had carried all these years that Harris had never made it out. Yet here he was, alive, not in uniform, not among allies, but working with the very network Daniel had sworn to stop. Harris's eyes searched for him with the same disbelief, the silence between them thick with everything unspoken, betrayal, survival, the unbearable weight of choices. Hunter shifted, sensing the storm of emotion that coursed through Daniel, his low growl vibrating against Daniel's leg. Daniel swallowed hard, his voice a rough whisper he could barely push past his lips. "Mark!" The name trembled in the air, carrying a lifetime of grief and brotherhood. Harris's jaw tightened, his hand flexing on the thermos, his eyes dark with something Daniel couldn't yet read, fear, guilt, or allegiance. Daniel's chest burned with the collision of two truths. His brother was alive, and his brother now stood among enemies. The distance between them was no more than 10 feet, but it felt like the width of a canyon carved by years of silence and the weight of choices neither could undo. Daniel stood frozen in the shadows of the truck yard, long after Mark Harris's stunned face had disappeared back into the dark, his chest heaving with the weight of betrayal and grief. Hunter pressed close, a low whine vibrating from his throat, pulling him back to the present, to the truth that no matter how badly he wanted answers from Harris, this was not the place to find them. Too many guns, too many eyes, too many ghosts. Daniel moved quickly, retreating into the tree line, the forest swallowing him again as the memory of his brother-in-arms lingered like smoke. He traveled through the night with Hunter at his side, the pack growing heavier with every step, until a thought began to take root in his mind, fragile at first but soon impossible to ignore. He couldn't do this alone. The files, the weapons, Harris, it was all bigger than him. He needed someone who could break the silence, someone who could drag the truth into the light where it couldn't be buried again. By dawn, his path was clear, though it twisted his gut with unease. He would have to find Sarah Miller. The name was a whisper in his memory, tied to sand and gunfire, to a day when chaos rained from the sky and he had carried her, dazed and bloody, out of the wreckage of a marketplace bomb. She had been a young reporter then, stubborn and fearless, embedded with his unit against orders. He hadn't seen her since that day, only heard rumors she had risen to become one of the few journalists willing to take on stories others were too afraid to touch. If anyone could be trusted to handle what he carried, it was her. The journey to the small city where Sarah now lived stretched across miles of back roads and abandoned farm fields, every step laced with the knowledge that the men who had burned his cabin were still hunting him. He traveled only at night, slept in short bursts under brush or in hollowed logs, Hunter always watchful, his growls the only warning Daniel needed when danger edged too close. By the third day, Daniel reached the outskirts of town, the neon buzz of gas stations and the low hum of traffic feeling almost alien after so long in the mountains. He pulled the brim of his cap low, kept his head down, and slipped through alleys until he reached the address he had scrawled from memory. A modest townhouse, plain brick, no sign of its occupant's importance, but Daniel felt his pulse spike all the same. He rapped softly on the door, once, twice, and waited. The door opened a crack, a chain still fastened, and a woman's wary eyes peeked out. For a moment, she did not recognize him. His beard was thicker now, streaked with gray, his face harder than it had been under the desert Sunday. But when her gaze locked on his, the years fell away. She gasped, slammed the chain free, and flung the door open wide. "Daniel? My God, Daniel Miller?" Her voice broke, half disbelief, half relief. He gave a curt nod, stepping inside quickly before eyes on the street could notice. Hunter padded in behind him, sniffing the air, circling once before sitting by the door like a sentinel. Sarah shut it fast, pressed her back against it, and stared at him as if he were both a ghost and a miracle. "I thought you were gone," she whispered. "Everyone thought you disappeared?" "I did," Daniel said, his voice gravel, heavy with all that lay between then and now. He placed the pack on the table, unzipped it, and pulled free the flash drive. He slid it across the wood toward her, his hand trembling with the weight of what he was entrusting. This is why I'm here." Sarah's eyes flicked from his face to the drive, confusion warring with recognition of the danger such a small object could hold. She hasn't touched it yet. Instead, she looked at him, her expression softening, and something unspoken hung heavy in the air. "You saved me once," she said quietly. Daniel shook his head, but she pressed on, her voice rising with emotion. "No, listen to me. That day in Mosul, you remember? The air was thick with smoke, everything crumbling around us, people screaming. I was trapped under the debris, my leg pinned. You had your rifle, your orders, your men shouting at you to move, to leave me. But you didn't. You threw your weapon down. You lifted me out with your bare hands. And then you disappeared into the dust again." Her eyes shone, and her voice trembled as she went on. "And later, when the chaos shifted, I saw you again, not with me, but with that boy. Do you remember him? The one with the shrapnel wound in his side? You carried him out like he was your own son. You shielded him with your body when the mortars hit again. I never forgot that. I never forgot you." Daniel's throat tightened, his chest burning with the memory of the boy, his small frame trembling in his arms, whispering words Daniel couldn't understand, but would never forget. He swallowed hard, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "He lived?" Sarah nodded slowly. "For a while. Long enough for his family to thank you. Long enough for me to see what kind of man you were. That's why I became what I am now. That's why I kept pushing, kept digging, even when it meant being silenced. Even when it nearly cost me my life, because I saw what you did when no one else was looking. And I swore I would not waste the chance you gave me." Her gaze dropped to the flash drive, then lifted again, fiercer now. "So don't you dare think I won't help you. You carried me out once. Now let me carry this for you." Daniel's eyes burned, his jaw clenched against the wave of gratitude and guilt that surged through him. He lowered his head, his hand reaching out to rest briefly over hers on the table. Hunter let out a soft chuff, as if affirming what Sarah had said, his amber eyes steady on them both. Daniel drew a long breath, the air heavy with the weight of trust reborn, and for the first time since the fire, since the betrayal, since the ghosts of his past had clawed their way back into his life, he felt a flicker of something close to hope. Sarah had barely finished closing the blinds when Daniel felt it, that cold tightening in his chest that always came seconds before hell broke loose, a sixth sense honed from years in combat. And he did not even have time to warn her before the first crack of a rifle shattered the silence of the street, glass exploding inward in a hail of glittering shards, the walls of her modest home vibrating under the sudden violence. Hunter was already in motion, his bark like thunder, his body a blur as he hurled himself toward the front window where muzzle flashes erupted outside. Daniel dove low, yanking Sarah with him behind the heavy oak table that now seemed like the only shield they had. The stench of gunpowder filled the air, choking, familiar, terrifying. "Stay down!" he barked, voice raw, as splinters rained over them and another volley tore through the room, chewing up plaster and wood like paper. Sarah clutched the flash drive against her chest, eyes wide with disbelief, but also something fierce, a journalist's instinct already calculating even in the middle of chaos. Daniel's hand flew to his sidearm, his shoulder pressed tight to the floor as he scanned the angles, years of muscle memory surging back. These were not random thugs. The precision, the suppressive fire, the silence between bursts, it was Iron Gate, no doubt, mercenaries trained to erase problems like him. His pulse hammered, but his mind went ice cold. He had fought worse odds, but never with so much at stake, never with someone who carried his last shot at redemption cowering just feet away. Hunter's growls grew deeper, guttural, feral, as the dog threw himself against the window frame, snarling at the shadows outside. Daniel rolled, aimed, and squeezed off 2 shots through the gaping hole in the glass. A sharp cry cut through the gunfire, proof his aim had found flesh, but it only drew more fire, the enemy tightening their circle. Bullets punched holes through Sarah's bookshelf, scattering decades of notes and clippings across the floor like snow. Sarah gasped, but forced herself flat, covering her head, every line of her body trembling with adrenaline. Daniel reached out, grabbed her wrist, squeezed hard to steady her. "Listen to me," he hissed, his eyes locking with hers, calm in the storm. "You move when I move. Understand?" She nodded, lips pressed tight, the fear in her gaze burning into something else, something like resolve. The firefight raged on, the walls of the house groaning under the punishment, Hunter barking until his throat seemed ready to tear, his body poised like a coiled spring, waiting for Daniel's command. Then it came, one shot cleaner, sharper, closer than the rest. Daniel felt it before he heard it, the hot punch of metal tearing into his flesh, the shockwave exploding through his shoulder. His body jerked violently, the pistol tumbling from his hand as pain ripped across his chest like fire. He fell hard, his breath knocked out of him, the world spinning into flashes of light and darkness. Sarah cried out his name, scrambling to drag him back behind the table, her fingers slick with his blood as they pressed uselessly against the wound. For a moment Daniel thought this was it, the long silence he had chased in the mountains finally swallowing him whole. But before the thought could root, there was movement, sudden and fierce, a storm wrapped in fur. Hunter lunged forward, a snarl ripping from his throat that sounded less like a dog and more like some ancient beast awakened. He threw himself across Daniel's chest, his body covering his master's with a weight that was both protective and defiant, his teeth bared toward the broken window, daring the unseen enemy to strike again. The sight stopped Sarah cold, her heart seizing as she watched the German shepherd, muscles taut, amber eyes burning, ready to give everything without hesitation. Daniel, dizzy and gasping, felt the warmth of Hunter's body pressing into him, the dog's heart pounding as if it were willing its strength into his failing limbs. He lifted a trembling hand, smearing his own blood as he brushed Hunter's fur, a whisper rasping from his lips. "Not you, boy, not like this." But Hunter did not move. He stood his ground, chest heaving, growl vibrating through Daniel's bones, as if promising that if death came through that window, it would have to pass through him first. For one suspended instant, time fractured, the mercenaries outside regrouping, Sarah's tears catching the light of the burning gunpowder, Daniel's blood dripping onto the floorboards, and Hunter poised like a shield forged of loyalty and love. The battle had not ended, it was only the beginning. The night of the assault still rang in Daniel's bones, his shoulder bound in a field dressing, his body aching with the memory of the bullet, but there was no time to collapse, no time to mourn. Sarah had dragged him into the basement after Hunter's defiant stand, and there in the dim light of a single bulb swinging above their heads, she stared at the blood-soaked flash drive in her trembling hand as though it carried not just evidence, but the weight of history itself. Daniel leaned against the wall, pale and fighting consciousness, his voice low but steady. "You said once you owed me. This is how you pay it back. Don't save me, save them. Save everyone who doesn't even know what's happening." Sarah's throat tightened, her heart pounding so hard it threatened to split her chest, but she nodded, wiped her tears with the back of her hand, and turned on her laptop. Fingers flew, adrenaline overriding fear, as she bypassed firewalls and pulled up her secured channel. Daniel watched through blurred eyes as the files opened, folder after folder of falsified manifests, encrypted calls, covert videos of Iron Gate's leadership colluding with foreign buyers. Each document was a blade, each audio file a wound, each video a revelation so damning it could topple giants. Sarah hit the button that would stream it all live. For a moment nothing happened, and then her feed went live. her face illuminated by the glow of the screen. She began to speak, her voice clear and unshaken despite the chaos above them. "My name is Sarah Miller. What you are about to see is not a rumor, not speculation, but truth carved in blood. Irongate, a company sworn to protect this country, has been selling American weapons to enemies abroad, orchestrating deaths for profit, and silencing those who tried to stop them. Tonight, the silence ends." She clicked through files, the images and sounds spilling onto the feed, transmitted across servers she had prepared years ago for the day a story like this would demand more than ink and paper. Across the country, televisions flickered, phones buzzed with alerts, screens filled with her broadcast. In living rooms and offices, in bars and crowded trains, people stopped what they were doing, their eyes locked in disbelief, outrage building like a wave no force could hold back. Hashtags exploded, headlines rewrote themselves in real time, senators were bombarded with calls, and within hours the president himself was forced to address the nation, his solemn voice confirming an investigation, his face etched with the recognition of betrayal at the highest levels. The Irongate name burned across every channel, no longer a symbol of strength but of treason. Agents moved in before dawn, arresting executives in glass towers, freezing accounts, seizing documents. The fortress that had hunted Daniel crumbled not in gunfire, but under the weight of its own lies exposed to the light. By morning, the roar of the public was unstoppable. Daniel woke in a hospital bed days later, his shoulders stitched and wrapped, the scent of antiseptic in the air. Sarah sat nearby, her eyes rimmed red from exhaustion but burning with victory. She leaned close, whispering, "It worked. They can't bury it this time. You did it." Daniel shook his head weakly, his voice gravel. "No, you did, and him." He turned his gaze to the floor where Hunter lay, bandaged but alive, the dog's chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, his amber eyes opening just long enough to meet his master's before drifting back into healing sleep. Weeks passed, the storm of politics and trials swirling far away, but Daniel wanted none of it. He returned to the mountains when he could walk again, the wilderness where his ghosts had always followed him, but this time the silence felt different. He began to rebuild, his calloused hands steady as he set logs, hammered nails, shaped stone. The cabin rose from ash like a promise renewed, each board an act of defiance, each wall a declaration that he would not be erased. Sarah visited once, bringing supplies and a smile that spoke of battles yet to fight but hope carried forward. She promised to return, to write the full story, but she knew he belonged here, not in the spotlight, but in the stillness where he could breathe again. Daniel did not argue. One morning, with the sun cresting gold over the ridges and the scent of pine drifting through the clearing, Daniel placed the final stone on a small wall just beside the cabin. It was not large, not ornate, but it was sacred. He had built a corner of remembrance, a place where the names of his fallen brothers would never be forgotten, where the memory of men who had bled beside him could rest in peace. Alongside the stones, he etched symbols of the dogs who had served and sacrificed, the silent soldiers who had never asked for medals. At the center, he laid a simple wooden plaque, for those who stood when others fell, for those who never left. He sat on the bench he had built, his injured shoulder aching but healing, his gaze fixed on the stones as if speaking to them in silence. Hunter padded over, his coat shining in the morning light, and without hesitation lowered his head onto Daniel's knee. The weight was grounding, warm, alive. Daniel's hand moved to rest on the dog's head, fingers threading through thick fur, and for the first time in years, his chest did not feel hollow. The mountains whispered around them, not with the ghosts of war, but with the promise of peace. Daniel closed his eyes, letting the quiet sink into his bones, and when he opened them again, he was smiling, faint but real, his past no longer a chain but a lesson carried. The fight had been brutal, the losses unbearable, but the truth had been freed, and with it came something he thought he had lost forever, the chance to live not as a fugitive or a soldier, but simply as a man with his dog by his side, at home in the stillness he had earned. If this story touched something deep inside you, if Daniel's fight for truth and Hunter's unshakable loyalty reminded you of the strength we find in love, sacrifice, and companionship, we would love to hear from you. Leave us a comment below with the part that moved you most, or share your own story of courage and connection. Your words might inspire someone else who needs hope today. And if you believe in stories like this, stories that honor loyalty, truth, and healing, please hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and join our community. Every like, every comment, every share helps these stories find a home in the hearts of others. Thank you for being here with us, and remember, sometimes the quietest moments hold the loudest truths.